everyone, and welcome to this CX Day webinar with me. I'm Bruce Temkin and Barry Schwartz with the title Infusing Humanity into CX. Welcome, Barry.
Hi, Bruce. Nice to be with you.
Excellent. For those of you watching, hopefully you're watching this on CX Day. We did record it earlier, but for those of you who don't know, today, the day you're watching this and went live, is Customer Experience Day. It is a day in October where we celebrate the great customer experience that companies deliver and the professionals that make that happen. And as part of that, we really wanted to explore Barry's work and look at how we can, as customer experience professionals, really put humanity back into the work that we do. And before we get going, I want to share with you a little bit about Barry. Now, I'm thinking that many of you might know Barry, but I'm also thinking that as customer experience professionals, you probably don't know how important his work is relative to what we need to do every day. Here are today's speakers. I'm Bruce Temkin, Customer Experience Transformist and Managing Partner of Temkin Group. I'm also the co-founder of the Customer Experience Professional Association, and yes, I am responsible for the creation of CX Day. It's now in its 5th year. But what I really want to do is spend the time in introducing you to Barry Schwartz. Barry is Emeritus Professor of Psychology at Swarthmore College. He has spent 40 years thinking and writing about the interaction between economics and morality. He has written several books that address aspects of this interaction. He has written for sources as diverse as the New York Times, Chronicle of Higher Education, Scientific American, the New Republic, Harvard Business Review, and The Guardian. He has appeared on dozens of radio shows, including NPR's Morning Edition, The Talk of the Nation, and has been interviewed on Anderson Cooper 360, the PBS NewsHour, the Colbert Report, and CBS Sunday Morning. And when I saw it was the Colbert Report, I had to go back and see it. And I'm hoping, Barry, that when we start the Q&A, I'll let you have more of the time speaking than Stephen Colbert did during your show with him. Barry has spoken 3 times at TED conferences, and I will, as part of this, give you links to that. If you like TED Talks, if you've never seen TED Talks, I watched his 3 TED Talks. They've been viewed by more than 12 million people. And maybe more importantly for me, I have to say, is it's a true honor to be here with Barry. Barry is one of a handful of researchers who I feel, he doesn't know this, but whose work has truly shaped sort of the direction of not only my work, my career, but my belief system. And I think that those of you who follow my work and Temkin Group's work, when we start talking about what Barry is doing, you are likely to see lots of those elements as the underpinnings of what we do. And so I want to give a shout out to Barry, because if you happen to see those overlaps, I can almost guarantee you that they started with Barry and infused into what I do. So before we get going, I want to just give you a huge thank you, Barry, for all that you've done for lots of people, but on a personal note, for me.
Well, thank you, Bruce. I'm really honored.
Now, Barry's done a lot of research, and I thought we'd just show you some of his work. So this is some of the books. He's published a number of books. They are great, and we are going to get to reviewing some of them, and 3 of them are covered in his TED Talks, and like I said, you get links to it. But I thought we'd start out with, I wanted to capture sort of the essence of Barry, the essence of your work, not getting into one book or another, which we will do in a bit. And what I did was I went to Amazon.com, and I took the descriptions of your books from Amazon.com and threw them in a word cloud. Now, I eliminated words like Barry and Schwartz because those ended up being pretty big. But other than that, I left them there. So I'd love to know, as you look at this, and it's sort of one way to recap the things that you've written, what do you see and how do you think about your collection of work?
Well, I would say that I have spent most of my career examining assumptions that have dominated modern society, largely from economics, about what people are like and what they care about. I have thought as you said in introducing me, for almost half a century, that economics has a very, very narrow, pinched, and inaccurate view of what people are like. And since it is the sort of the prince of the social sciences, what economists say, everyone swallows. So my mission in life really has been to point out the limits of that view. It's true in five of the books I've written in one way or another. I think people are rich, complex, morally sensitive, want to do the right thing, not selfish or not entirely selfish. And you wouldn't know any of that by studying economics.
It's interesting to say that, because one could also make the same case against or around psychology, right? That psychology has been sort of a break-fix type of focus for years, and now, like as I look here, I see things like happiness. That the notion of even on the psychology end of looking at people as not things that need to be fixed, but as finding ways that people can have more inspired and more meaningful lives. Has that played into your work as well?
It has indeed. Martin Seligman is a good friend of mine, and when he was the president of the American Psychological Association, he sort of launched a movement that he called positive psychology. And as he puts it, it was about moving psychology from a place where it was trying to move people from -5 to 0 to a place where it's trying to move people from 0 to +5. That is, what does it take for people to be fulfilled, for people to thrive and to flourish? Psychology has not paid much attention to that until the last 15 or 20 years. It now arguably pays, I would say, a little too much attention to that. It's like happiness is important. It's not the only important thing, but you wouldn't know that by reading, especially the popular press. But you're right. It was really focused mostly on identifying and damage and repairing it, and that's not true anymore.
So it's interesting how the sort of the economics and the psychology pieces of it have sort of shifted to provide a way to look at human beings differently than we have in the past. I think if you look at one of the words that jumps out of this word cloud to me is certainly memory, and the notion of remembered experience, right? The way one of the things we teach in customer experience is for people to think about how customers remember things, not how they happen. And it's interesting that long term, probably your happiness and the way you feel about it is more about how you remember something than how it actually occurred. Has memory been a big piece of, it certainly is a big word in the cloud, has it been a big piece of what you looked at?
Well, not so much me, but I wrote a book with a collaborator called Psychology of Learning and Memory, which is why memory appears is so prominently in the cloud. And it is certainly true that psychology has spent years and years and reams of paper trying to understand the nature of human memory. But mostly it's been about how does memory work? What is it? Why is it imperfect? How is it imperfect? And stuff like that. Your point, which I think is completely true, that we consume memories more than we consume actual experiences, has largely been neglected by psychology. Daniel Kahneman, who won the Nobel Prize in economics more than a decade ago, although he's a psychologist, has focused on the way in which our actual experiences relate to our memories of those experiences. And to say the least, the relation is less than perfect. And we spend most of our time consuming our memories, which means that if you're in the business of, serving customers, you want to know what aspect of the interaction is going to be positive, and even more, what aspect of the interaction is going to be incorporated into the memory so that your customer decides to come back.
Yeah, it's funny. Daniel Kahneman's work is great. It's also a foundation to some of the stuff we do. And for those of you listening in, if you might have seen me speak or been at a workshop where I will talk about Daniel's work around colonoscopies,
Yes.
which is part of his foundational work. There's nothing more jarring than in the middle of some speech going to a discussion around colonoscopies. So I always found that was like an interesting way to do it.
It is, although, the trouble is that, just as a trivial side point, when they did the study, it was not routine to anesthetize people when they had colonoscopies. Now it is routine. So when you tell people about how unpleasant colonoscopies are, if they've had them, mostly what they remember is that they were unconscious. And that wasn't true when he did the work. They really were unpleasant.
So he probably should redo the study with the preparation the day before.
Yeah, the preparation remains the hell on it. There's no question about that.
So I want to go back to the happiness thing here, and I'll periodically during this discussion share some of our data to look at. And we do so. Temkin, we started about 5 years ago tracking what we call a well-being index of U.S. consumers, where we look at their agreement with statements around happiness, healthiness, and financial security. So we're tracking sort of well-being along those three dimensions. Mm-hmm. And I pulled out one component of it, which is people who agree with the statement, I am typically happy. And I just want to point out and get your thoughts, if you have any, on sort of thinking about the time series of your research, looking at sort of where people are at. The last 2 years, we've seen a decline in, at least in our measurement of happiness, the percentage of people who think they are typically happy. And I'm wondering if from your work, if you've seen anything structurally that's happening that may be dragging people back. Maybe there's just, and we'll get to it, just more and more choice. But any ideas on what might be causing this?
Well, first of all, I wouldn't want to invest a lot of effort in explaining something that may just be noise. What's striking to me about the slide you put up is how stable happiness ratings are. Let me turn this off. Sorry.
That's the wonderful part of live live recordings.
So I'm not sure there's a phenomenon there. When I write about this, I take a longer lens because one of the points I try to make is that despite dramatic increases in standard of living over a period, say, between World War II and now, in Japan, the standard of living increased by a factor of 5. In the United States, it increased by a factor of, 2.5 or 3. But ratings of happiness changed not at all. So they didn't go down, but they didn't go up. So actually, there's some evidence that they did go down over that long a period. But my point is simply that money doesn't make you happier. Or at least it doesn't make you very much happier once you've crossed over the subsistence line, whatever that is. It makes you trivially happier. And considering how much effort people put into just being a little bit richer this year than they were last year, it may be a sign of misplaced attention and energy. So that's been my main focus. I think if people are less happy now, what I would guess, though I don't have data, is that a significant contributor to that is a growing sense of insecurity. Happiness research has really underemphasized the importance of security, social security, financial security. And I think that a far larger percentage of the population feels uncertain about the future now than was true a decade ago or 20 years ago. And that probably figures into people's assessments of how happy they are.
It's interesting that you talk about the standard of living goes up, but happiness doesn't necessarily. And it leads me into sort of the when I think about some of the work you did around paradox of choice. There's so many quotes that you have that are just wonderful to replay. But one of them with paradox of choice is that we're creative accountants with our psychological balance sheet, right? Sort of like we think that we're going to be happy with a higher standard of living, and we're just not really good at sort of factoring in what really does make us happy. And I think that's maybe a lead into what I want to do now is I picked out 3 books. The first one is The Paradox of Choice, which I have to say was probably the first thing that I read that made me rethink how I viewed sort of human beings from a customer experience standpoint, like how I view the actual behaviors of people. And then we'll move on to Practical Wisdom and Why We Work, which is some of your newer books. But just as we look at these 3, one of the things that sort of jumped out at me as I think about the collection of things is that you've started to really look at work. I don't know, has that been a shift in sort of where you're focused on, looking at people and work, or has that always been a part of it that you think you just got to the point where you're like focusing on the work aspect in your recent work?
It's always been a part of it because I think sort of the most important manifestation of the economist's view of human nature is what it implies about why people work. People work for pay. If the pay is good, nothing else matters. If the pay is bad, nothing else matters. You can arrange the incentive structure so that anyone will do anything. And that's been one of the ideas that I have been criticizing for 40 years. I just never, until my most recent book, and to some degree Practical Wisdom, I never actually wrote a whole book just about that topic. But it's been on my mind forever. It's been on my mind as I taught students. Why do students study? The presumption is they study for grades, which in turn will get them into graduate school or get them a good job. But the notion that students study because they're actually interested or because they want to become better people, that's nowhere present. And efforts to make students better are all about engineering incentives so that students will work harder. But the incentives never have anything to do with what they're learning. It's a gold star or a free Happy Meal at McDonald's or something like that. And, it just completely goes against my own personal experience and also my experience teaching. I taught at a great institution, Swarthmore, that's wonderful, wonderful, highly accomplished students. But it's amazing how unimportant grades have been in explaining why students put in the effort they put in. They're really, curious. They have high standards. They want to develop skills that will enable them to have an impact in the world. And a grade is it's like the cherry on top. Although, in recent years, because of economic insecurity, that's become a little bit less true. They no longer take it for granted that when they graduate, they'll get a great job. They always used to. At places like Swarthmore, everybody got a great job when they graduated. Well, now, maybe not. So now, all of a sudden, they're worried about having impressive credentials, and it's actually affecting the way in which they approach their studies. So my experience over many, many years suggests that economists have simply missed the point, and people applying economics have missed the point when they try to incentivize work so that people will do more of it and do it better.
It's interesting that you talk about economists missing the point. So I work in a different space. I don't work with sort of academics per se. I work with large companies, large brands around the world, and leaders at those brands. And I would say the leaders in organizations have missed that point, right? That I think the economists may have missed it somewhat, but I really have found that leaders misunderstand what people truly need and what truly motivates people, and that I actually started this set of 8 outdated management principles I call modernized leadership as sort of my push to get leaders to think differently. But it's interesting. So you look at it and think the economists missed it, and I look at it and think the leaders I'm working with don't get it.
Oh, I agree with you completely.
And well, I want to go back because we're sort of jumping a little bit to why we work, which we'll get to in a second. But I want to get your perspective on just sort of the key findings across these 3 different books, and maybe sort of what you think the key lessons are from the paradox of choice.
Sure. So the paradox of choice has 2 major points. One is that we have assumed, not unreasonably, that the more choice you give people, the better off they are, because the more choice you give people, the more likely they'll be able to find exactly what they're looking for. And the point of the book, The Paradox of Choice, is that that's not true. That some choice is better than no choice, but more choice can be worse. And in fact, more choice can be paralyzing rather than liberating. You can't pull the trigger because you don't know which direction to pull the trigger in. So you end up not choosing at all. Or if you do choose and you get a good thing, a good result, you're still disappointed because you imagine that one of the alternatives would have been better. So from a user experience point of view, focusing on giving people every imaginable option is doubly defeating. It defeats the customer because the customer ends up either paralyzed or dissatisfied, and it defeats the seller because the seller sells less. And when the customer is dissatisfied, they don't blame choice, they blame the product. So they don't come back. That's what that book's about. And it's totally counterintuitive.
Yeah. And one of the things that you talk about is the example of blue jeans. How and in the world, and I remember that world, you sort of had, I think, Levi's and Wrangler, and those are the jeans you had choice of. Now you're overwhelmed by them. And one of the things you talk about is when you make the choice and go home with whatever it is in the story you tell around the jeans, that you tend to not necessarily even just blame the product, you blame yourself for not making the right decision. And so that self-blame actually adds to the negative result of the choice.
That's correct. Yeah, and the argument I make is that when all you have is Levi's and Wranglers, and you buy a pair of jeans that doesn't fit perfectly, and you ask, whose fault is that? The answer is it's the world's fault. Jeans only come in 2 flavors. What could I do? But when they come in 2,000 flavors and they don't fit exactly the way you want, and you ask whose fault is it, it seems just as obvious that the fault is yours. If you had looked harder, if you had looked longer, if you had looked in different places, you would have found the perfect jeans, as if such things existed. So yes, you end up blaming yourself, and that can have negative effects that go far beyond what you feel like when you put your jeans on.
Yeah, if we're in a world where choice is growing, does that mean for it's more important for people to learn how to become more satisficers than maximizers? Is that like a skill that people may need to have in this world of more choice?
I think so. When all you have is Levi's and Wrangler, there isn't much difference between looking for good enough jeans and looking for the best. You can look at all of them. But when you've got thousands, now all of a sudden it matters. So yes, in a world of essentially unlimited choice, I think it's extremely important for people to understand that good enough is virtually always good enough. And it will reduce paralysis, and it will increase satisfaction if all people want is a good enough pair of jeans, and a good enough restaurant and a good enough vacation and a good enough job and so on and so on. But it doesn't come naturally to a lot of people. It takes practice. The evidence is that people who are maximizers by nature are less happy, more depressed, less satisfied with their lives, and less satisfied with their decisions than people who are satisficers by nature. But it's not like it's coded in the genes. It's just a set of habits that can be changed.
So here's my call to everyone out there. Be happy with what you have. Don't be unhappy with what you didn't get. All right. So let's move on to practical wisdom. And I have to say, the TED Talk on practical wisdom made me cry. It's one of the more powerful TED, and I'm a big fan of TED Talks. Getting really rich content in 20 minutes is great. But it sparked something in me that I have to say I don't think I've had with any other TED Talk that I've seen, because the combination of the humanity in it and also resonating with sort of things that I had seen but didn't know how to articulate at all. So maybe share with the audience, your key takeaways around practical wisdom.
Sure, you're very, very kind. And I must say, when I gave that talk, which was an appeal to Aristotle, and Aristotle's thinking about what people are like and what matters, to a room full of high-tech, cutting-edge young people, I was worried that they'd basically hoot me off the stage because it was so, it was so not of this world. And the reaction I got was extraordinary. It was not unlike yours. I've never gotten a reaction like that to any talk I've ever given anywhere. And I think it's because the point of the book is that people really are longing for opportunities to do the right thing and often feel defeated by the structure of the situation, defeated by the demands that are placed on them by their supervisors, so they can be successful, but feel at the end of every workday like they need to come home and take a shower. They can be successful, but not particularly inclined to tell their kids what they did at work that day. And they want to be good people in the world and not just successful people in the world. And my point, and the point of the book, Practical Wisdom, is that Aristotle understood that. What it means to be a good person is to do the right thing. And it's often complicated to figure out what the right thing is. There's no formula. There's no algorithm. When you're talking to your kid, the right thing may be forcefulness or it may be gentleness. It may depend on the circumstance. It may depend on the kid. Forceful with your first kid, gentle with your second kid. If you're leading 25 kids in a classroom, the right way to teach each kid depends on the kid. There's no right way for everyone. It takes an enormous amount of judgment. It takes empathy. It takes the ability to listen carefully to what you're being told. But if you cultivate wisdom in yourself and in others, the result is not only that you do better work and that you feel better about the work you do, but what we suggest in the book is that it's actually in some ways the secret to happiness, because Freud a century ago said two things matter to people: love and work. And what we argue in the book is that to love well, you need to be wise. To love your friends, your romantic partner, your children well, you need to have wise judgment. And we argue to be a good doctor, a good teacher, a good hairdresser, a good hospital custodian, you need to be wise. And so wise people will end up doing better work and having better relations with the people who matter to them in life. And as a result, wise people will be happy people. So that's the thrust of the Practical Wisdom book. And a lot of it is devoted to the war on wisdom that is now occurring in workplaces, in government, almost everywhere. People think that if you just come up with the right set of rules and make everybody follow them, or the right set of incentives and dangle the gold stars or the M&Ms in front of people's noses, then you'll get institutions that work properly. And what we say is that those approaches are doomed to fail in most areas of our lives.
So we were talking about practical wisdom, and one of the things that you talk about, Aristotle defines practical wisdom as a combination of moral will and moral skill, with moral will being the desire to help and moral skill being the ability to know when and how to apply that. Is your sense of, so moral will almost feels like that's something that's personal and innate, whereas moral skill is something that feels like it would be heavily influenced by the environment you're in.
No, I think both of them are influenced by the environment. One of the lines of research that we discuss in that book, and also in the book Why We Work, is how when you incentivize behavior, when you give gold stars or M&Ms, you take people who desire to do the right thing because it's the right thing and turn them into people who do the right thing because they're getting paid. So if you live in a world where everything is incentivized, moral will goes away, because the question you're asking is, what's in it for me? That's what incentives teach us. Always ask the question, what's in it for me? Not what do I owe other people, not what do other people expect of me, not what does my profession expect of me, not how do I serve my client so that my client walks out of the store with exactly what he or she needs, not more and not less. Instead, how do I maximize my compensation? How do I get promoted? How can I increase commissions? How can I upsell the customer? It's completely different. So I think that, it's possible some people have more of this will to do right by other people than others, but you can take Mother Teresa and turn her into, somebody who's basically out to just get as much out of you as you possibly can.
So is that a case where, so it sounds like it might be easier to sort of cut into moral will than to create more moral will in someone?
Well, we don't know how to create more. The argument that we basically are making in the book is that people are, as I said to you a few minutes ago, people want to do the right thing. They want to come home from work at the end of the day feeling like they have somehow, in some small way, made other people's lives better. And so you don't need to do a lot to nurture that. But you can certainly do a lot to undermine it. And I think that, just as we were saying before, that people who run companies are clueless about the assumptions they make about human nature, that's reflected here. Instead of giving employees the opportunity to do right by customers, they create these incentive structures that are focused on maximizing return on investment, which often, not always, but often means doing wrong by customers, which is very short-sighted as a business strategy.
And ends up not maximizing profits in the long term.
That's correct. And you would think that by now, people who run companies would have learned this, because this is not a new insight. People have known this for years, and yet they always, whenever there's a trouble at the company, they retreat to, how can I incentivize my workers so that they'll be more productive? Instead of, how can I reshape the company so that people actually feel legitimately that at the end of the day, they've improved people's lives in some way.
Great. And part of practical wisdom, there's a quote that I love. Well, there's lots, but without wisdom, our work will likely be both mediocre and dissatisfying, which I think is, to me, there was a natural sort of flow into the Why We Work book, right? I saw that connection pretty cleanly. I think that quote sort of brings in, so maybe share, and we talked about it a little bit at the beginning, but share some of the key findings from Why We Work.
Sure, and you're right and perceptive to see the connection. I regard Why We Work as a kind of very brief and focused extension of what the wisdom book was about, specifically to the workplace. So why we work makes a couple of arguments. One is this is what people care about in their work. They want to be engaged. They want to be challenged. They want to learn. They want good relations with their colleagues. They want to be respected. And they want to do work that's meaningful, which for most of us means work that has a positive effect on the lives of others. And it doesn't have to be grandiose. It doesn't have to be a cure for cancer. It could be that your client walks out of the hairdresser feeling better about herself than she felt when she walked in. Small things can have an impact just as big things do. So this is what people want from work. And of course, they wouldn't work if they didn't get paid. But when you ask people why they do the work they do, pay is not what comes up as the answer. It's these other aspects of the work. And yet we've created workplaces that make it essentially impossible for people to get any of these satisfactions out of what they do. You know, the model of the assembly line, which can be just as much a white-collar assembly line as a blue-collar assembly line, basically assumes that all people want is a paycheck. They want to work as little as possible to get as much as possible. So how can we design a system where people don't take initiative, don't need to take initiative, and by dangling the incentives, we can get them to work hard? And the argument I make in the book is that this evolution of the workplace is a reflection of the ideology that comes out of economics, starting with Adam Smith, the father of the market, that the only thing people care about is their paycheck. But it's an ideology that is extremely hard to change, even though most people who set up workplaces don't think of themselves in the way they think of their employees.
Oh, that's interesting. One of the things that we try to talk about with leaders is the notion of, which I think you get out a lot, is the notion of intrinsic rewards. The notion of meaningfulness, control, competence, and progress, right? The things that we get from the work, not the compensation. And yet, you know, I think I might do a study on this and look at how much of leaders' time is spent focusing on the intrinsic rewards that they're allowing to be created for their people versus the compensation, right? Because if you look at leaders, probably when they think about their people, there's probably an enormous amount of time they spend thinking about compensation and almost no time thinking about intrinsic rewards.
Right, and there's a whole industry, right, of compensation consultants. They're there to tell you how to set up compensation structures to basically, you know, give your workforce a kick in the ass. I don't see a whole industry of meaning consultants there to help you turn the workplace into something where people at the end of the day feel like they've done something meaningful and engaging. I think you're absolutely right. And it's really profoundly mistaken, in my view, to be focused in this way. It's easier to manipulate compensation than it is to manipulate meaning. You know, if you're actually setting up a company to exploit your customers, then you basically have to find a way to lie to your employees so that they will somehow think that what they've done at work that day has made somebody's life better. So if your aim is not to contribute to welfare, then you can, the Band-Aid you can put on that is you pay people well. My experience talking with folks in the high-tech world, people like at Google, where I've done a little bit of consulting, is that they've come to the conclusion that they just can't pay people any more than they already do. It's not about the money. Everybody gets paid plenty of money. The question is, you know, why do you show up for work every day? How do they make the work engaging? How do they allow people to be engaged in projects where they can see that if the projects succeed, lives will be made better? And so there's an enormous amount of attention paid in places like this to what does it take not to make the work meaningful, but to keep the work meaningful. When people come, they're all excited about the new thing, but after a while, it just becomes the old thing.
The thing.
How do you keep them feeling like they've made a difference and are continuing to make a difference? And they know that they can't compensate for work that doesn't have this characteristic by paying people more, because they're already paying people. There's just nothing to be gained by increasing salaries that are already ridiculously high. They have a real retention problem. Google's a great place to work, but they're always worried about losing their talent to other, to startups, to places where it really feels like you are going to contribute to making a meaningful difference in people's lives. All you're sort of doing now at Google is maintaining, and you're tired of maintaining. You want to do something that's new and that matters. So they spend a lot of time thinking about how do we keep this work such that people feel like it's work worth doing, not how do we engineer incentives so that people will show up for work every day. And I don't think Google is unusual. It's unusual in the sense that it has more resources than most companies, and it's obviously more successful. But I think throughout the high-tech world, this is the issue. How do we keep good people interested and engaged? Money isn't the answer.
So it's interesting. I want to share with you some research we did, and I'm going to skip this lack of practical wisdom, which was research we did completely based off of the inspiration. We won't look at that one, but I want to look at this. This is literally, I think we published it this week. That's how new it is. So we do every year we do a employee engagement benchmark in the U.S. where we ask. This time it's about 5,500 full-time U.S. employees from a bunch of different companies, and in here we ask them their agreement with statements. I feel good about the work that I do. I'm proud of my company. I'm appreciated my job. I am paid an appropriate amount. And so we have the agree and disagree. But the percentages are the people that are likely to look for a new job in the next 6 months.
Yep.
So we ask them, are you likely to look for a job? And you can see that pretty clearly their view on pay has the considerably less impact, almost no impact on whether they're looking for a job or not. It's these other things. They feel good about work. They're proud about their company. They're appreciated at their job. I think the data fully supports what you're talking about at companies like Google. That, but why is it? And you, I mean, I'm frustrated sometimes with this. Why is it that we can't get leaders to, be more like Google and stop thinking that compensation thing is the piece that's going to make people want to stay?
Well, I think there's a change slowly happening, but it's sort of like turning an ocean liner. It doesn't happen with a snap of the fingers. The evidence I'm aware of is that young people, millennials, and women care even more about the meaning and significance of the work they do than the typical employee. So if you're a company that wants to be attractive to young talent and to half the workforce, namely females, you're simply going to have to reevaluate the conditions, not just the compensation, but the conditions of work, and ask, is this the kind of work that people who want to feel that what they do is meaningful will be attracted to? And if you conclude that it's not, then you are excluding from considering you the people you most want to attract. Now, obviously, in times of economic downturn with high unemployment, people will take whatever job they can get. But, these things, those conditions don't last forever. It's already the case, I gather, that it's not quite a buyer's market when it comes to jobs, but the unemployment rate has become quite low. So how do I attract these talented people who are graduating from wonderful schools? How do I get women to consider working here? How do I get young people to consider working here? And the answer is, I have to make our enterprise one that adds value to the world. And then the job will sell itself. So I think that this resistance that you've encountered is diminishing, and more employers are going to be enlightened because the workforce demands it. The workforce will simply say no to them unless the jobs they're offering provide opportunities for meaning and engagement. That's my hope, anyway.
It's interesting. So I want to draw a distinction, which actually plays into. So the next, I want to shift gears and talk about sort of how we apply this to customer experience. And this is our model of competencies in customer experience: purposeful leadership, compelling brand values, customer connectedness, and employee engagement. So we were talking about, in, I think, broadly terms of employee engagement, and I want to draw a distinction between the things that you're talking about, which I think I totally agree, which is the sense of work having meaning versus the notion of, some people talk about employee experience. And I always find myself trying to get people to know the difference in the nuance. In one case, it's, we're going to have a bunch of pizza parties and, free candy, versus finding a way that the work that they do provide meaning to them. And to me, those are two completely different things, and that the long-term value to the employees on the meaning stuff, not on the free pizza parties. I don't know if you've sort of done things, if you've run into companies thinking about the experience of employees, not just the meaningfulness of them.
No, I agree with you completely. I think this focusing on experience is a way of trying to solve a problem on the cheap, and not giving up any control over what your employees do in the course of a day. And I think it gets old in a heartbeat, and it won't work. You're right. People are willing to work hard. They are willing to do jobs, aspects of which are not in any way pleasant, as long as they're convinced that there is some benefit, some value coming from what they do. And you can't paper over the lack of value by giving people a pizza every Friday. The same thing is true in education. I think that's absolutely right. What you want, there's this old, surely apocryphal story about somebody encounters a guy making bricks in the broiling hot sun, and asks him, what are you doing? And the guy says, I'm building a cathedral. Well, he's not building a cathedral. He's doing the most mundane thing imaginable, taking mud and putting it into forms, right? Except the way he sees his work is that he's building a cathedral. And of course he is, in the sense that if there weren't people like him doing what he was doing, the cathedral wouldn't get built. And the hospital janitors I write about in both the wisdom book and the workbook, all they're doing is mopping floors and emptying trash and restocking cabinets, just as you would expect. But some of them who have an attitude toward their work that we call a calling, they think they are contributing in an essential way to easing suffering and curing disease. And of course they are. The hospital couldn't work unless the janitors were doing their jobs. So you can see yourself as punching a clock and washing floors, or you can see yourself as contributing to the health and welfare of vulnerable people and their families. And the trick, if you're running an institution, is to figure out what it takes so that most of your janitors think they're building a cathedral and not just washing a floor. There's a retail company that I much admire and shop in a lot called the Container Store. And the striking thing about that place, from my point of view, is that everyone I have ever encountered in any of the stores really thinks their job is to figure out what my problem is and solve it. Even if that means having me walk out of the store with nothing, because what I think is going to solve the problem isn't. never ever try to upsell. They are completely committed to the mission that they have something to offer that solves problems, not huge problems, but problems nonetheless. And that's why they're there. And I have never seen morale in a retail store that compares to the morale of the employees at the Container Store across many shops. So it's not the local manager. It's something in the water supply or in the ethos of the company that inspires people to do great work. And it's totally mundane, right? You're just selling them pieces of plastic for them to store their junk in. But the junk has to go somewhere. Why not sell them the right piece of plastic to store their junk in?
I don't know if you shop at Trader Joe's, but
yeah, Trader Joe's is another one.
Yeah, it's funny because one of the things that I always do, since we always look at employee engagement, I always ask whoever I'm working with at a store, at an airline, how do you like your job, right? And it's interesting because you get some answers back, but and they always love it at Trader Joe's, a Container Store, absolutely. One of the places where I've seen, I do this all the time, and one of the places where I've seen the most dramatic shift that I've ever seen is at Delta Airlines. So, I think, 5 years ago when I've been asking this for a long time, right? You ask, how do you like it work here? And they'd roll their eyes and, give you a huff. But there's actually a visceral difference. They like say, it's great. I like what I do. And it's amazing because to me that shows that you can change it. Like that it is sort of in the environment, not just in the people.
But you're not going to change it by giving them pizza parties. You're really going to, the way you change it is by changing your own mission or by honoring a mission that's, a perfectly laudable mission, but one that isn't taken seriously by anyone. If you take your mission seriously and it's reflected from the top of the organization to the bottom of the organization, you can transform people's attitudes toward their work. They don't think they're being lied to by the supervisors. They expect that if they have an idea that will improve customer service, they will be listened to, since the aim is to produce great customer service, whatever it may be. So I don't think it's easy to change a culture, but I also don't think it's impossible. And it turns out that it's one of these cases where you do well by doing good, because when you change the culture, your bottom line gets better. This is not an act of financial sacrifice. And that's the hard lesson that needs somehow to be communicated to people who create workplaces.
So before I had all these slides, and we're not going to get to them, but I want to just touch on one element of here, and then we'll go to a close, which is the purposeful leadership. So the competence that we look around purposeful leadership are, do leaders consistently operate with a clear, well-articulated set of values? So what we look for in an organization is if they have values that are clear, then people can understand what they need to do to live up to those values. And people can make decisions on their own that are consistent with those values. And so people have more control over what they do because they understand the value system of leaders. So that's how we look at it. But I'm wondering, when you think about leaders, so in your broad spectrum of understanding, and you work and you go in and talk to leaders, what are you looking for in terms of a leader, not now, but a leader of the future?
Well, I think you put it right. But the key word in your purposeful leadership box on that slide is the word operate, as opposed to articulate. So there are lots of leaders who talk a good game, and they then, what they don't do is make sure that the game they are talking is infused in the organization. So I can be the CEO of GE and say wonderful things about how we're trying to improve the quality of life of consumers around the world, and maybe even mean it. But meanwhile, the people who run my divisions know that whether they keep their jobs depends on meeting margins. And I don't care how they do it as long as they do it. So what I've done is insulate myself and my wonderful speeches from the day-to-day operation of the company. And it becomes very obvious, I think, to employees that the mission, the articulated set of values, is not being operated on by the people who articulate the values. So you have to mean it. And you have to scrutinize your organization and make sure that somehow those values are being embodied from top to bottom. And that's, I think, mostly what's missing. We all know how to talk a good game, but only a few of us know how to put the game we talk into practice in the field.
I love a quote that Cory Booker says that his mom used to always say to him, which is, "What you do speaks so loudly that I can't hear what you say."
Well, that's true.
Excellent. So I'm going to jump ahead to sort of our closing and slide, and because this has been such a great discussion, I wish we could keep it going forever, but I think about an hour is about the limit for not just Barry and I, but anyone listening to this who wants to spend more time on that. But before I thank Barry, I have one final question. As I said, I'm a huge fan and been inspired, and I'm wondering what you want the next generation of Barry Schwartz followers. I'm one of them. I feel like I want to continue your mission and push forward. What do you want people like me or anyone who's listening to focus their research on going forward?
It's interesting. I'm a college professor who teaches psychology. So, I have an interest in the shape of the institutions and practices that we interact with in our daily lives, the kinds of outfits that you consult with. But the real question for me is, what do I want the next generation of psychologists to be doing? And I would say the thing I most care about is that people choose to work on problems that matter. And just as is the case in the commercial world, in the academic world, what it takes to get ahead is often not the same as what it takes to improve the world. You pick narrow problems to study, you publish lots of papers on them. It makes no difference to the world that those papers get published, but you get tenure. And you're there to get tenure. Or, you make it easy and entertaining for your students so that you'll get good course evaluations, and that will also contribute to your getting tenure and promotion. You're not asking, what do I need to do so the students learn what they need to learn, but what do I need to do so the students like me? And so I would urge the people who are training the next generation of psychologists to pay a lot of attention to cultivating in them a sense of taste about what things are worth the effort, what's worth doing and why. And I think we're very good at giving them skills so that when they figure out what they're going to be working on, they will know how to work on it in a way that's respectable and reasonably rigorous. But what I'm less confident of is that they will know what to choose to work on, what problems need to be solved, unless they get more guidance from us. And at the moment, I think we are largely not guiding them in that most important of all questions. So I have always prided myself on spending my time on things that I think matter. Of course, I could be wrong, but I've never done anything that I didn't think mattered. And I would hope that the next generation of psychologists will do the same.
And I think that's a great lesson, not just for the psychologists, but for everyone listening. Even my kids who will probably watch this, I think there's a lesson there about working on things that matter. So let me say thank you, Barry. It's been a huge honor, and I've truly enjoyed it. The hour flew by.
Well, it's been a pleasure. You asked wonderful questions, Bruce.
Thank you. And for those of you who are interested, if you happen to be watching the video and it's not attached to the page that it's on, then go to humanizecx.com, because at humanizecx.com you will be able to get links to Barry's work, to the TED Talks, along with some of the research that I've referenced from Temkin Group. So once again, humanizecx.com, and thank you, Barry. Thank you for sharing this CX Day with me, although recorded, but going live on CX Day.
Great. It's been a pleasure, Bruce.